Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's good to be with you. We're going to now get into our second lecture on the Hindu traditions. First, let's recall what we've already discussed. We talked about the origins around the Indus River, the Indus Valley, the Indian subcontinent, from which the Hindu traditions emerged out of this culture which pre-existed it, the Harappa culture. We also talked about the sacred text, the oldest sacred text within the Hindu tradition, the Vedas. The Vedas, these books of wisdom, these books of knowledge, and there's 4 different types of Vedas within the Vedas, which develop over time, going back to 1,000 years before the Common Era. In each of these different types of Vedas, again, is separated out into, has 4 subdivisions. The 4 subdivisions, the first part within each of these 4 Vedas has mantras and words of blessing. The second part has rituals and sacrifices and ceremonies, whereas the third part has commentaries on these sacrifices, these ritual rites, and so forth. And then there's the fourth part. So within each of these 4 collections of Vedas, there's 4 parts. And the fourth part is called the Upanishads. The Upanishads are important because in the Upanishads you get these texts that are discussing meditation and philosophy. These are philosophical texts. These are the philosophical component division within the Vedas. The Upanishads, which come as the final section within each of the Vedas, were composed in the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era. So within the earliest of the writings within the Vedas, the earliest Vedic scriptures, there was an emphasis placed on placating the gods by sacrifice. Whereas within the Upanishads, in the later Vedas, this emphasis on sacrifice is replaced with this emphasis more on philosophical inquiry. So in part, what the Upanishads do is they interpret the early hymns and sacrificial rituals in an allegorical manner, that is not in a literal manner, but within a trying to seek out the inner spirituality, the inner sense of these hymns and of these rituals. By the way, you see this within lots of religious traditions. Within the Jewish tradition, within the Christian tradition, there's also this emphasis on allegory, the spiritual meaning of the literal word said. So there's lots of examples of this, but for example, when we talk about within the Hebrew Bible that the Lord our God is like a tower or a fortress, certainly the Lord our God is not, within the Jewish tradition, is not literally physically a tower or a fortress. No, it's a metaphor, right? We're using this metaphor to point to something that is even more true than that thing that you're looking at. Because God, the Lord God, is more, right, than just a tower. It's more than just a fortress. Those are metaphors. So in the Upanishads, they interpret those early hymns and those sacrificial rituals in a metaphorical way, in an allegorical way. The Upanishads take the form also of a dialogue. Think about maybe Plato's dialogues. Dialogues are very important. It's a very effective way to wrestle with and invite the reader into reflecting upon what is true. So these Upanishads are in the form of a dialogue between a teacher and a student, or between a husband and a wife, or between fellow philosophers. So the Upanishads are important, and I wanted to start with the Upanishads to connect it back to the Vedas and to recognize that within each of these 4 collections of Vedas, these Vedas themselves are subdivided. And the last part within each is philosophical commentary, which is in the form of a dialogue, and these philosophical commentaries are called Upanishads. One example, just quickly for an Upanishad, one scripture, if you will. Here you go. Just a little bit of wisdom for us as we continue on. Speak the truth. Practice virtue. Do not neglect to study every day. Oh, gosh, really? Do not neglect truth, virtue, study our teaching. Give with faith. This is the secret of the Veda. It's beautiful, right? It's called Taittiriya Upanishad 1.11, 1 through 6. It's beautiful. Speak the truth. Practice virtue. I like that. I like the notion of virtue must be practiced. It's not just a conceptual thought, nor is it just a given. Virtue, we practice virtue. We exercise virtue. Do not neglect to study every day. Now here I wonder, for me, I think about study as going into the library, but what if it means something else, right? I'm thinking in my terms, my context, and I'm trying to understand what study means to me, but study, you can study every day without going into the library, right? You could, I mean, to study means, what does it mean to study? I would wonder about that. Do not neglect truth, virtue, studying, or teaching. And I like this part, a little bit later, you have the ellipsis there. Give, but give with faith. Give with faith. What does that mean? To give with faith. Interesting. This is the secret of the Veda. So the Upanishads, as we start going towards the teachings within the Hindu tradition throughout the course of this lecture, a lot of these teachings come out of various texts within the Hindu tradition, various Vedas and so forth, and certainly a lot of them come out of the Upanishads, the philosophical portions within each of the Vedas. In addition to the Upanishads, another important sacred text within the Hindu tradition is the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita translates as the Song of the Lord. It's this poem. It's this epic poem set within the Hindu scriptures. It's part of a longer poem, by the way. I believe it is, according to most, the longest poem ever, and it's called the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is this long poem, and it has lots of different stories, events, narratives within it, but it's really, this poem is like a poem about war. And this is also what you get within the Bhagavad Gita. I'm mentioning the Bhagavad Gita because it's an important text. It's one of these popular texts that many Hindus know, have read. It's talked about. And also within it, it's kind of a good text. It is a great, it's a really great text. Within it, oh, by the way, I'll give you an extra credit opportunity to write a reflection on select excerpts from the Bhagavad Gita. That'll be another extra credit opportunity coming your way if you want that. So, and I'll give some guided reading with that. Anyhow, within the Gita, it's set to a narrative framework of a dialogue between a prince named Arjuna, and his guide who's named Krishna. Now, Krishna is an avatar. Krishna is an avatar, is a manifestation of the avatar Vishnu. And they have a dialogue. This dialogue is set within the context between Prince and Avatar. And it's in the context of a war. The war is called the Dharma Yuddha War, or this righteous war, Dharma, right? Between two different groups who are cousins, basically. The Pandavas and the Kauravas. The Kauravas and the Pandavas. Now the Pandavas is the tribe, the community from which Prince Arjuna comes out of. The day of war is approaching. And the Bhagavad Gita begins by Arjuna communicating, saying to Krishna in this form of a dialogue, he's communicating, he's saying, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go to war and have to kill my cousins, my family. That does not seem just. So he turns to Krishna and asks Krishna for his counsel. So in the midst of this dialogue back and forth, you have Krishna breaking it down for Arjuna, and basically in the process giving key Hindu teachings along the way. such as, why are you fretting so much about death, Arjuna? Don't you know that death is just an illusion? It's just temporary. But the atman within the Hindu tradition, the atman is the soul. And the soul is that thing which within you is permanent. That thing which is true. And everything else, all these other things that we see in the physical world, these things that are substrates, are partial, our soul, these our skin, our what we wear, our accolades, our accomplishments, all these external things are really just illusions. They're fading. They're going to come and go. You're going to get older. You're going to lose hair. You're going to gain weight. You're going to become less flexible. You're going to lose strength. And eventually you're going to die. But none of those things, your hair, your weight, nor your degrees or accomplishments, your whatever happens to be, are who you really are. Who you really are, or what you really are, you are atman. You are a soul. And that soul will never die. So that's one of the teachings that Arjuna receives from Krishna. Krishna calls upon Arjuna to have some perspective on life. Furthermore, and we've talked about Dharma before in our first lecture. We talked about Dharma being the closest term within the Sanskrit that could be translated as religion. Dharma can also be translated as, say, obedience or faithfulness. And most often, Dharma is translated as duty. The thrust of Krishna's advice to Arjuna is simply this: do your duty. You are a prince. Your people are relying upon you to do what a good prince does. And what a good prince does, when necessary, is defend his people, even if it means killing another, even if the other is a cousin, a relative. This is not easy stuff. It's not necessarily easy to fulfill your duty, your dharma. Hence, even the prince Arjuna needs encouragement. So this poem, which is part of this longer epic poem, the Mahabharata, is again called the Bhagavad Gita. Within the Bhagavad Gita, within this back and forth dialogue between the prince and Vishnu, Vishnu gives different teachings, different practices, different ways by which one could be liberated. Now, to be liberated, or liberation within the Hindu tradition, the term for this is moksha. So the goal is to be liberated. To be liberated from what? We should always ask, when the term liberated is used, what does one need to be liberated from? Within the Hindu tradition, one needs to be liberated from this endless cycle of birth, life, death, suffering, birth, life, death. That endless cycle. So within the Hindu tradition, within the Hindu traditions, there's this teaching that focuses on that the soul, atman, as we mentioned, is permanent, but it needs a place to be housed, and it migrates after death from one body to the next. This cycle of reincarnation. This cycle of reincarnation is a treadmill that you want to get off. Riding a treadmill, it could be kind of boring, right? Riding a treadmill could be kind of, I don't know, after a while painful. It could hurt. No one likes to be on a treadmill. Getting off that treadmill is called liberation. It's called moksha. Within the Bhagavad Gita, Vishnu gives three different ways by which one could jump off the treadmill, be liberated from this cycle, which is again called Samsara within the Hindu tradition. So these three ways, these three forms of discipline, let's talk about those now. They're important. They're important within the Bhagavad Gita, and also they're important within the teachings of the Hindu tradition across the board. The Bhagavad Gita, I think I mentioned, is like a very, very popular text across the many different forms of Hindu tradition, Hindu identity across India and beyond. So it's kind of it's a text that appeals to a popular Hindu audience. So within it, again, you have these three ways of liberation. And the three ways of liberation, the first is karma yoga. Karma yoga, are way of action. It's this path of unselfish duty. And it's performed neither in fear of punishment nor in hope of reward. This is an important moment too from within the Bhagavad Gita, where Vishnu kind of gives advice and kind of tells the prince that be careful that you do not do these ways of action, karma. Karma means action. You don't do this action because you are in fear of punishment or because you want some reward. Because to expect a reward leads to bondage and happiness, because that thing you hope for, that reward, eventually will bring misery, will let you down. You're by clinging, you're going to suffer. That reward's not going to last forever, right? You get an A on an exam, or you get a new job, or you get a new car, and you're happy for how long? So it's just a cycle of desires not being fulfilled that lead to suffering. That cycle you want to. So action, right to action, karma yoga, right action, it is done without hope of reward or fear of punishment. Because if you're clinging after a reward to get that reward, it's going to know what's going to lead to. It's going to lead to the accumulation of more karma, and then lead to other rebirth, which is not what you want if you're a Hindu. So Krishna urges Arjuna to act without attachment to the consequences. You do that which is good. You do the good action, the karma action, because it's the fulfilling of Dharma, not for a reward. The second way of knowledge, or the second way of liberation, is called Jnana Yoga. This is the way of knowledge. And we may achieve a transforming wisdom that could even destroy our past karma. So there's an efficaciousness to knowledge. Knowing can lead to liberation. True knowledge is insight into the real nature of the universe, the real nature of all that exists, and how temporal and fleeting and changing and impermanent it is. And also the realization that behind all of this, and all of this division that we see and participate and create throughout the world, that all of that is just an illusion, and that ultimately all is one. That's the ultimate illusion. And to know this, you don't just learn this in some roundabout way. You know this because you've practiced the discipline of meditation, of sitting still, of listening, of chanting, and doing these different practices, which ultimately are going to cultivate this wisdom. So just like virtue must be practiced, wisdom, knowledge must be practiced. It's not just found by doing a Google search on the internet. You know what I'm saying? True wisdom, wisdom that is liberating, is found through these disciplines. We'll talk about them more, but this is the second path, or the second way of liberation. And the third and final way is called Bhakti Yoga, the way of devotion. This particular form of devotion, way of liberation, is the one that is most emphasized within the Bhagavad Gita. In a conversation between Krishna, who again is the avatar of the Hindu god Vishnu. You have this conversation back and forth in which Krishna emphasizes to Arjuna that liberation, your salvation, it comes through being devoted to me, by loving me, by putting your trust and faith in me. So this concept, right, this exchange, you see this in other religious traditions as well, that salvation comes by the way of devotion, by the giving of oneself. And you do devotion, you demonstrate devotion in certain particular ways. We'll talk about some of these practices in a later conversation on the Hindu traditions. So those are your three ways of liberation: the way of knowledge, the way of devotion, and the way of action. So let's conclude this lecture by talking about one particular school or tradition, philosophical tradition within the Hindu traditions itself, which is called the Vedanta tradition. The word Vedanta means the end of the Vedas. So the Vedanta tradition, after the Vedas were firmly established in written form, then you have a different but similar ways of thinking about, reflecting upon the Vedas in these similar ways, and these traditions are together become a tradition called the Vedanta tradition that emerges after the end of the Vedas. And they're not only in conversation with the Vedas, but also within this tradition, this philosophical school, if you will, they are interpreting the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and other sacred texts as well. So one of the leading early thinkers within this particular tradition is Shankara. Shankara was active through the 9th century Common Era. Just a couple of things that Shankara taught, and these will be our final points on the teachings within the Hindu tradition. Of course, much more could be said. 1. Shankara taught that reality is non-dual. It's not two-sided, right? Non-dual. The only true reality is Brahman. Brahman, as we know, is the first principle, right? The universal principle on which everything else finds its way of being. But also at the same time, Brahman is above being. Brahman is, again, ineffable. Brahman is that which is above, but that which is within everything. Brahman permeates everything. So because of that, because everything is permeated by Brahman and resides within Brahman, which is this universal first principle, if you step back and think about it, right, then perhaps maybe it is most reasonable to say that all this distinction and division, all this duality, is just illusion. As a matter of fact, for Shankara and for money coming out of the Vedanta tradition, but there is diversity, by the way, within the Vedanta tradition, which we'll talk about in a second, but for money within the Brahman and Atman, within this tradition, within this dominant tradition, philosophical tradition of the Hindu traditions, Brahman and Atman are identical. There's a well-known phrase from the Upanishads, which says, "You are that," which means there is no difference. You are that thing which you're looking at and which you're holding in difference. You're one and the same. It's only under the influence, another teaching from Shankara, under the influence of illusion or Maya, that we believe that there's differences within the world. But when this illusion is dispelled, the soul is liberated by the realization of its true nature. So what is liberation in the Hindu tradition? In part, it's the removal of ignorance and illusion by this transforming knowledge, which we just talked about, right? The Jnana Yoga, the way of knowledge. And we can achieve this liberation while embodied, without binding to our desires, which will help us achieve this ultimate release, which will only come after the death of the body. Now, within the Vedanta school, like many schools and traditions, there is internal diversity. There's disagreement. So, for example, Shankara's teachings did not go unchallenged. Munaja, for example, another teacher, he challenged Shankara's insistence on this concept of Maya or illusion. Ramanuja reasoned as such: if Maya is real, then there are two realities, Brahman and Maya. And if Maya is unreal, it cannot be the cause of this cosmic delusion that you are attributing to it. So in response to this challenge, Shankara, he insists that Maya is indescribable. It's neither real nor unreal. And it is this thing which is ineffable. So thus such conversations and criticisms about Maya are nonsensical. Now, if you're having a moment of pause and trying to wrap your head around that mystery, I don't know, maybe in part that is the point. That religious traditions, religious thinkers are not meant to be simply people who answer our questions. In part, perhaps, religious thinkers, people who articulate the depths, the profoundness, the richness of the religious traditions they inhabit in all their perplexity and beauty. Perhaps in part, what their task is, whether it be Shankara, whether it happen to be Thomas Aquinas, whether it happen to be Philo of Alexandria, whether it happen to be Augustine of Hippo, whether it happen to be the Buddha, perhaps in part, what they are tasked to do is not just to give answers, but to create these spaces in which we are to live in these questions. The task of a religious tradition might not be, in fact, to always have airtight answers to all the problems in the world, such as the problem of pain, evil, and suffering. But perhaps religious traditions are to give us ways and means by which we are to endure in the midst of suffering, pain, and disillusionment, and progress onwards, forward, even without totally understanding why we are in this pain, suffering, and disillusionment. I don't know. Still thinking about it. I'm going to leave it here. So please take a review. We've covered maybe about 10 identifications that are important for our kind of comprehensive understanding of the Hindu tradition. And I'll see you next time. We'll pick it up soon. Peace, take care, and many thanks.